It's been a busy 6 months in politics. It feels like a lot longer. All leading up to the federal election, now just months away. So what issues should we continue to keep a close eye on during the summer months? Which ones could shape the election campaign? What better group to tackle this than these guys? At issue here for our last panel of the season. Oh my God, somebody touch wood. Before we take a little hiatus, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, Paul Wells, all here in Toronto. And I may call you during the summer. You don't have to answer, but there's a good chance I'll probably call you. Anyway, I just want to frame it around, heading into the election and how these issues may or may not affect an election. So let's start with Canada's problems with China. So I guess this is really our overall approach to foreign policy, but in particular, how things have deteriorated, I guess, with China. Here's some of what the Prime Minister said after meeting with President Trump.
I also spoke at length with the President about the wrongful detention of 2 Canadian citizens in China and continue to call for their immediate release.
I know that foreign policy generally doesn't affect voters. It's not something people keep in mind when they go to the polls. But when you see how a leader has handled the China file, is that something that people will be thinking about as we, over barbecues and whatnot? Whether you agree with what he's done or not?
Yeah, it can go to the questions of judgment and competence in the Prime Minister. There's been a number of files where I think people would say the Prime Minister has not been particularly at his best when it comes to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, or the India trip, et cetera. And when his vulnerability is that sense that maybe he's in over his head, to use a line from the past, then that's germane. I don't think you can fault him for his handling of this specific question of the Canadians in China. That's a very, very delicate thing. I can't fault them at all. I think the larger point that could be made is this government was very naive/cynical about China in its first years. It had this kind of amateur geopolitics it was going to that China was the rising power, the U.S. was the fading power. We were going to align ourselves more closely with them.
Free trade agreement, all that, yeah.
And I think a lot of people would say that was very ill-advised, that they had not taken stock of the changes that have been happening under Xi in China, and that this is a very different beast that we're dealing with than we might have imagined 5-10 years ago.
Although I remember Harper too had hot and cold with China, right?
I'm guessing all those great foreign policy thinkers who spent the Harper decade saying Harper wasn't doing the right thing and wasn't engaging China have all disappeared under this table somewhere. And suddenly Justin Trudeau was naive and he should have known when, as far as I can tell, they spent a decade writing op-eds to say Harper is not engaging and should be engaging.
I was about writing those op-eds.
No, I'm not saying. I'm talking about those foreign policy wonks who seem to always have a better advice to second-guessing the government of the day. I think on this issue, a lot of Canadians are going to give a bit of a pass to Justin Trudeau because they're going to say it's ultimately Donald Trump's fault. With the Trump trade war with China, with the kind of language between the two, I think it's pretty clear that we are bit players in a drama that we did not seek. And to this day, I still think the India trip is better weapon for the opposition and has stuck more than any of these files.
And the fact that he can't get anybody on the phone, the fact that they don't want to talk to him. I mean, those aren't. I realize it's China, and that's hard. It's hard to manage, but I don't know what that says.
There's parts of this that are almost like a Russian novel. I mean, the idea that the Trudeau family has a special relationship with China runs deep in the psyche of people named Trudeau. It was his dad who opened up diplomatic relations with Beijing. His brother has written essentially a travelogue book about what fascinating people the Chinese are. And Justin Trudeau, within weeks of announcing his candidacy in 2012 for the Liberal leadership, was writing op-eds saying essentially, China's the key to our prosperity and I'm the key to China. China is a big riddle facing every Western country. And I think we've had more sophisticated discourse about that in most other Western countries than we've had lately in Canada.
I think that actually on foreign affairs, the Prime Minister has done a pretty good job. When you look at the relationship being managed with the President of the United States, the fact that both parties, both major parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, are basically singing from the same songbook when it comes to China, it's hard to imagine how Andrew Scheer would be approaching the situation any differently. That's why I don't really think it's going to play in the election. Yeah. In a way that we might see foreign affairs play in the election is actually through diaspora politics. And we don't really talk that much about that, and maybe we should, but there's definitely issues happening in the Indian community, whether it's with the Hindu community and Sikh community, or how the Conservatives typically target the Chinese community. There may be messages that we are not aware of that are being played kind of below the surface in mother tongues that we don't actually realize until perhaps weeks into the campaign.
I want to talk about climate and pipelines because obviously after the past couple of weeks, that's the conversation. Is the election going to be about climate and energy and how we balance those two things? I think I have a clip here of the fine line the government has tried to walk in all of this.
Those who want sustainable energy and a cleaner environment know that I want that too. But in order to bridge the gap between where we are and where we're going, we need money to pay for it.
That, of course, the announcement that the government is going ahead with TMX. I don't know. I have a hard time thinking that the election will center around that issue, but maybe I'm being naive. Maybe it depends who you are. I don't know.
Well,
I can't answer that question, but I've been looking at the pipeline decision and the way that it came across, and I've been thinking that over the past few months, from Rachel Notley to Jason Kenney, there's been a shift in the paradigm of the discussion from pipelines to national unity.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that Jason Kenney would be happy about that, but I believe that it has helped Justin Trudeau make this decision more politically palatable. That the optics is not just I choose pipelines and I choose, but it's also I choose what helps national unity, or at least by reframing it that way, they have actually made it easier to sell to Canadians who may have had the knee-jerk reaction of saying pipelines bad, climate change good.
I've been saying for some time it will not be as central as I think some people are imagining, partly because any issue that's that big, people can see coming a mile away, and what you've been seeing is the parties moving closer together. You saw the Liberals covering themselves off by making sure they approve Trans Mountain Pipeline so they can continue with this, we're okay with development as well as dealing with climate change. And you see the Conservatives coming out with a plan, however flawed it may be, but to show that they're somewhere in the mainstream on that debate as well. So partly for that reason, partly because of the regional dynamics of this. If you're in Alberta or Saskatchewan, you've made up your mind, you're not going to be voting Liberal. This issue is not going to be up for grabs in play.
Right.
And similarly in Quebec and British Columbia, you're probably not going to be hugely affected. Where it can, I think, be germane is in Ontario. And I think because to some extent it goes to questions of Ontario's identity. Is Ontario a province like British Columbia and Quebec? Is it a kind of a modern, urban province with sort of progressive ideas about these things, or is it more like a Alberta province? Is it more like a what's its sense of itself? I think is partly what's up for grabs here.
Is it progressive or
is it or is it conservative?
Yeah.
Or does it want a friend of the premier that it doesn't like as prime minister?
Yeah.
Very basic question.
One thing that's been interesting and that'll be worth watching through the campaign is that there's elements of the Trudeau electoral base of 2015 that have essentially radicalized or that don't buy the compromises that Trudeau is selling.
Have gone further left, you mean?
On electoral reform, on Indigenous reconciliation, to some extent on gender. Not they radicalized, but they think that Trudeau has sold out. And on the environment. Look, the selling point for Trans Mountain is that there's plenty of room for something like this within Canada's emission caps. And a lot of the comment that I saw on social media was, who cares about your emission caps? We're trying to save the planet here. You just told us we're in a climate emergency. And so...
Which they did on Monday night.
Yeah, and so that's why we're seeing the NDP and the Greens both competitive with the Liberals in British Columbia. And it'll be interesting to see whether Trudeau can call those voters home in a polarized election.
I think that different issues will play for different parts of the electorate. And will millennials vote on the environment? Perhaps. Will women vote on the environment? Perhaps. What I am surprised by in the plans that the parties have laid out is that they're not really surprising at all.
No.
The Liberals have always tried to be this Goldilocks, like not too hot, not too cold, right in the middle. And anybody paying any attention knew that the Trans Mountain was going to be approved. And to Chantal's point, he could have gone and taken a hard left stance and said, you know, I made this declaration initially approving Trans Mountain because of Rachel Notley and her environmental plan and her price on carbon and how she was going to attack coal and the 100 megaton cap on the oil sands. And now Jason Kenney is not giving me a firm cap. And, well, now he's kind of silent on it, but he's not come out and said, yes, I fully support the Rachel Notley plan. The price on carbon, we're imposing it. That I am going to take a hard left. I'm going to go after those voters that Paul talked about, and we're going to chase the rest of those new Democrats and bring them into the Liberal fold. And instead, he went with his traditional viewpoint, which if you look at the speeches he's given in the past, it is really about national unity. Like, I don't think Justin Trudeau gets up in the morning and thinks about the environment. I think he thinks about national unity. That is the one thing that has been consistent in all of his public declarations over the last couple of decades.
But it's not about the country splintering. It's about how am I helping the whole
how
country?
do you help hold the country together?
I think it's about how do I win this election.
Well, okay, fine, I agree.
I win this election by trying to stay on the center ground on this debate. And if he had done that, he would have given up the center ground.
Yes, totally.
Oh, absolutely.
He could go after the Liberal and the NDP and Green vote if he had a really scary Conservative party that he could say you have to come to the Liberal corral.
Exactly what he's trying to do.
What you've been seeing Scheer doing over the last couple of weeks is making himself materially less scary. Those series of speeches were all very reassuringly mainstream because he could see that the liberal vote on the hold in the center was a little bit vulnerable because of the SNC Lavalin and stuff.
But this is also the fulfillment of that promise. The environment and the economy go hand in hand. Hard to go back to the polls if you don't improve the pipeline.
Yeah. Okay, thanks everyone. We're going to be right back with another round of At Issue after the break. This time, it's your turn to ask the questions.
Hi, At Issue.
My question for you is...
My question for tonight, the panel is...
Question to At Issue.
My question for the At Issue panel is...
Just some of the many viewers who sent in their questions this past season. You're not answering all of those tonight. We wanted to get to a few tonight. At Issue back for another round. Chantal, Andrew, Althea, and Paul all with me in Toronto. Okay, let's start with Connor Peters. Here's his question.
Why is the PPC polling so low, and what threat do they really pose to Conservatives in October?
Okay, why is the People's Party polling so low? Are they a threat? Paul.
Maxime Bernier is a bad campaigner so far. You gather support by reaching out to people, by appealing to them, by giving them hope for a future. Maxime Bernier spends his time on Twitter complaining about his coverage. I honestly expected he would have rallied more support by now. I don't know whether he can rally more support this fall.
Can't you rally support by making people angry, though? Didn't Donald Trump show us that? Isn't that what he's trying to do?
Yes, but you've got to to make a lot of people angry about things that they could be angry about, like economic insecurity. Right. That's not where this is going. Yeah. And when Maxime Bernier says, I'm the free speech guy, so we can have a debate about abortion, he may be winning some votes there, but he is also turning off a whole bunch of people who are saying, I'm not going to vote for a guy who wants to go down that road. And he's done that with immigration. He's done that with a number of issues that were not his forte during the leadership campaign. No. It's been a Jekyll and Hyde thing.
Yes.
From a very economic candidate to someone who seems to really want to be popular with what I would call the fringe of the conservative movement.
I think there's a number of factors. One is the candidate himself, Maxime Bernier, is not a particularly impressive character. He looks good on paper, but when you actually get into the meat of the substance, he's not a particularly impressive person. Secondly, we're not America. We've not gone through the kinds of traumas that they've gone through. We don't have the same constituency for that kind of populist appeal, particularly when it goes into anti-immigrant type of rhetoric. That just does not play well. And the third thing I would say is the conservatives who were discontented with in the Stephen Harper years because they weren't very small c conservative, who might have been listening to Maxime Bernier's message, were listening to him during the leadership race, are content enough to stay with the party now because they're so annoyed with Justin Trudeau.
I don't think the problem is Maxime Bernier. Mr. Bernier can be quite a charming fellow, and he's willing to talk about policy that he's interested in depth. The problem with the PPC party is that it's shrunk its coalition because it's being seen as appealing to racists. So even if there's things that are interesting in the platform that you may like, maybe you're an anti-abortion person, maybe you're an anti-supply management person, but you don't want to be associated with these wing nuts. So the coalition is too small.
Cynthia Thompson, originally from Ottawa, but today sent us this question from Texas. To eat barbecue or something. Here she is.
Hi, At Issue. I was curious to know what role climate change will play in the next federal election. Thank you.
We sort of went over that, so I'm going to, Cynthia, if you don't mind, just tweak your question slightly. What role will the Green Party play in the next election? Is that the big thing that we don't know yet?
It's an interesting wild card. It will be interesting to see how vote splits happen. I know a lot of Liberal MPs are worried that their vote will go to the Greens. We saw even in the Outremont by-election a surprising result from the Greens. On Vancouver Island, what role, especially in South Vancouver Island, are they able to pick up some seats? What role does Elizabeth May play during the debate? Does she come to help prop up Justin Trudeau, or is she an adversary? Lots of questions.
Someone please mention the NDP, otherwise I'm going to get an email here about it, because I just realized we haven't discussed them at all, and maybe that's the issue.
I mean, the calculation was that the NDP was so weak, and it is weak, and it remains weak, that the Liberals would win off the NDP weakness. Right. But some of that Green vote is Liberal, there's no doubt, but some of that Green vote is NDP, and those NDP votes are not going to the Liberals. So the first problem for the Liberals is figuring that out. That being said, you need a ground game if you're going to win, or you need to select your battles. And I don't think a national campaign will bring the kind of seats. I think what Elizabeth May wants out of this campaign is perhaps the balance of power in a minority House of Commons. Well, you're not going to get that with a national campaign, because even if you carpet that support, it doesn't bring.
But you know what? But that's a good. But maybe the NDP should be playing that game too, not doing the whole national thing and looking for just the places it can win.
But that may be the biggest impact they have in the election, and not in a way that perhaps they intend, is as a talking point for the Conservatives. And it's a valid message to say, if you're thinking of voting Liberal in a minority government situation, what you may get is not the Liberals, but the Liberals propped up by the Greens. And are you happy with that perspective, you centrist voters who might be tempted to vote Liberal?
Okay, I got to leave it. I would sit here for hours with you, as you all know. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.